Yeah, football starting. Yay, great. Take McCaffrey number 1 overall, they said. Everything will be good. Yay, great. Whole damn fantasy team blowing out their knees and getting their kicked everywhere. How could I be so pissed to throw my phone at the TV? And how the hell did it fall? Never should have tried to catch it. Kyle called me? Missed call from Kyle.
I'm going to say this to you one time. You, 2020. You.
Damn, Kyle. 2020 ain't my fault. What the hell? God. Oh, mother! What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there today. We're talking about some running backs. Well, whatever running backs are left after week 2 and all the injuries that we saw here last week. It was absolutely horrible for a lot of fantasy football teams out there. I mean, we lost the likes of Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, even Raheem Mostert. That hurts a lot of teams out there this year for 2020 fantasy football. But we're going to look here at week 3. We're going through every matchup, every game, every player, trying to make sure we can find those guys that we can throw back into our lineup to try to salvage our season here for 2020 before we get into all those matchups. So let's take a look back at week 2 and see how we actually did. After all the dust settled, we figured out we had 49 running backs that were given a start or sit designation that actually made it through their games this past week. Out of those 49, 37 were correctly given the right designation for an accuracy percentage of 75%. Not too bad, all things considered, for week 2. Some of our biggest hits: Leonard Fournette, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Did he just take that job away from Ronald Jones? We'll talk about that here in a couple minutes. Kareem Hunt, David Montgomery, and Jerick McKinnon, a name we're talking about a lot this week as someone who could potentially fill some holes. He was a hit for us last week also. Some of the biggest misses: James Conner. Apparently, Benny Snell is not a thing in Pittsburgh. James Conner came out, played great. He was a miss. James Robinson, producing for the Jaguars. Darrell Henderson, all of a sudden he's a thing in LA. And Nyheim Hines absolutely disappeared and screwed over a lot of people. Another one of our misses there in week 2. But now we move forward to week 3. How do we set our lineups? What decisions do we make? Let's head into the first matchup right now, where we're talking about the Miami Dolphins and Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, how surprising have the Jags been the first 2 weeks of the season, right? First week, they upset the Indianapolis Colts. Second week, they almost upset and get the victory over the Tennessee Titans, losing just 33-30. James Robinson's been a great find for them, too, here to start the season. He's averaging right around 18 touches a game, and he's playing in over 50% of the snaps, which means we really don't have to worry too much about anybody taking that workload away or Chris Thompson in the passing game. In fact, he's averaging right around 14.5 fantasy points per game in half PPR scoring. The great thing is the Miami Dolphins, they allow over 19 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I have no issues this week firing up James Robinson. I'm looking for him to have a pretty solid game there Thursday night. What about on the Dolphins side of things? You got Myles Gaskin, who really seems to be the guy in that backfield, right? I mean, right now he's out there dominating 65% of the snap share, and I really don't understand why they brought in Jordan Howard and Matt Breida just to use Myles Gaskin. Kind of seems like the 2020 Dolphins thing to do, right? Well, Gaskin's averaging just under 10 fantasy points per game at 9.9, but he's going up against a Jacksonville Jaguars team who just basically held Derrick Henry in check for the most part. On the season, the Jags are giving up 21.9 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. However, I'm not rushing to my lineup to start Myles Gaskin. It's just not somebody that hopefully I have to rely on this early in the season. Listen, I get it. You may be decimated with injuries, but right now Jordan Howard is the one seems to be dominating the goal line touches, but that's all he's getting, so his ceiling is super low. Myles Gaskin's getting more touches, just not doing a whole lot with it and doesn't have that touchdown upside. That means that he more than likely, if he's on my roster, he's on my bench unless I have no other options to even remotely think about. Texans and Steelers now, and hang on, David Johnson owners, just hang on. We got to get through one more week, right? I mean, I didn't love David Johnson last week. I had him as a sit, and yeah, it turned out great, but I hate to do that, but you got to look at these matchups. Going up against the Baltimore Ravens, now the Pittsburgh Steelers here this week, it's just not an ideal matchup for one David Johnson. Now, Pittsburgh only allows 12.3 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's fourth best in the NFL. David Johnson is averaging right around 13.5 touches, which is great. He's getting right around 12 fantasy points a game, which is solid RB2, RB3 numbers, especially this year with all the injuries. I'm not saying that I hate David Johnson. There's no way that I start him. But I look at the options that I have and I think about it, right? Because this is not one of those matchups where on paper, it looks like he's going to find a lot of success. If you have other options, I look at those other options. I'm going to label him as a sit, but this all depends on what the makeup of your team is. If you have no better options, then you start David Johnson and you cross your fingers. It's just not that great of a lineup. What about for Pittsburgh? Well, apparently James Conner's 100% good to go. I mean, we thought Benny Snell was going to be a thing. A lot of people thought Benny Snell was going to be a thing. James Conner dealing with a low ankle sprain. Didn't seem to matter, right? In week 2, James Conner dominated the touches over Snell 18-2 and saw 77% of the snaps in that offense. Now, Houston, they allow a lot of points to running backs. How many? 28.1 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And now, with Benny Snell's usage kind of up in the air, I mean, week 2 kind of scares me off Benny Snell because that is a heck of a floor. We saw a great ceiling on week 1. Week 2 was complete opposite, right? He only saw 15% of the snaps. He's not worth trusting. As far as I'm concerned, James Conner is a start for me absolutely this week, and I'm not looking anywhere else in this backfield as of right now for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Bengals and Eagles now, and everyone wants to hate on Joe Mixon. I totally understand why. I mean, he's underperformed here the first couple weeks of the season, but there's one thing that you can say about Joe Mixon. He's healthy, and you can't say that about a lot of running backs right now, especially ones that are getting the type of volume he's still getting. He's touching the ball on average 20 times a week, which is great. That's what we're looking for. The problem is he hasn't found the end zone, and he's only averaging 8 fantasy points per game. Now, the Eagles, they allow right around 21.7 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and there's no way in a time like this you can afford to bench Joe Mixon. You have to be a little bit patient. Better days are coming. For Philadelphia, how awesome was it to see Miles Sanders back out there on the football field? Yeah, we had a few casualties week 2, but we got him back, so that is a definite good thing. He saw 23 touches, 131 total yards for Miles Sanders, a great fantasy day, a great first game of the year for him. He also saw 7 targets in the passing game, which is great. That's what we're looking for to give us that safe floor on a weekly basis. He saw 77% of the snaps, so Boston Scott isn't going to take anything from him. And the Bengals allow 34.3 fantasy points per game, second most in the NFL to opposing running backs. I love me some Miles Sanders here in week 3. Niners and Giants now. We got no Mostert. We got no Barkley.
Our pets' heads are falling off!
Right, a lot of injuries right here in this game. Barkley being out for the year sucks the worst. Some good news possibly. There's a good chance that Raheem Mostert only misses maybe a week or 2 with his MCL injury. That's something we need to pay attention to here over the coming days, the coming weeks. So, what about Dion Lewis and Jerick McKinnon? Are we excited to start either one of them? Actually, I like Jerick McKinnon quite a bit this year. He's averaged 12.8 fantasy points per game, despite only getting 4.5 touches per game. So the efficiency is 100% there. But he won't be alone in this backfield, even though there's no Tevin Coleman either. We're going to see some Jeff Wilson Jr., the tax guy. I mean, it sounds like the guy that does my taxes. However, he's going to be involved in this backfield, and do not be surprised if he actually out-touches McKinnon here this week. Do I want to trust that, and do I want to start Jeff Wilson? I really don't if I have better options. In my opinion, the efficiency and the involvement in the passing game make Jerick McKinnon a lot safer for me here in week 3. As for Dion Lewis, I don't hate it, right? I mean, San Francisco, they've lost Nick Bosa. They lost Solomon Thomas. We know there's a few pass catchers that are banged up for the Giants. We could see a heavy dose of Dion Lewis. More dink and dunk Dion Lewis, right? Maybe not one of those guys that's going to go out there and break off the big runs, be overly efficient. But this week, he could see the volume. So if you landed him through your waiver wire process or you put in a bid for him and you get him, he's somebody who, if you're desperate, I don't hate starting here this week in week 3. Raiders and Patriots now, and Josh Jacobs didn't exactly light up the box scores here in week 2. However, whenever he touched the ball, he just looked so good. And honestly, he's touching the ball a lot, 29.5 touches per game on average, and he's currently the running back 4 in half PPR scoring. Now, New England, they allow 19.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and you can expect to see a lot of Josh Jacobs once again here in week 3. He's an obvious must start. Now, for New England, thoughts and prayers go out to James White and his family having to deal with what they are with his mom and his dad going through that horrible crash. Sometimes life is bigger than football, and we don't hold it against him whatsoever, but honestly, he's the only guy I have any interest with in this backfield in New England. Cam has absolutely killed the value of Sony Michel and Rex Burkhead almost single-handedly. Those guys are averaging right around 8 touches a game. That doesn't really excite me very much, and we just really need to wait and see what happens with James White. If he's out there playing this week, that's my choice. If he's not, if James White misses another game, I'm not going to start either one of these guys. No way, no how. I mean, we saw the likes of a Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara really take advantage of the Las Vegas defense through the air. Their pass catching, right? That's what really propelled them in their matchups. I mean, the Raiders allow just over 30 fantasy points per game, 4th most in the NFL. A lot of that coming just these past 2 weeks having to deal with Kamara and McCaffrey. If they can involve James White in the passing game, if he plays, I like that start. Otherwise, I'm avoiding all the running backs there for the New England Patriots. Titans and Vikings now, and really no questions here, right? Sure, you may be slightly disappointed with the output you got from Derrick Henry in week 2, right? 25 carries for only 84 yards. We would expect maybe a little bit more, and we're hoping for a little bit more, but the volume is going to continue to be there, right? He's touching the ball just under 30 times a game, and the Minnesota Vikings defense gives up on average 22.5 fantasy points per game. There's no reason to sit Derrick Henry. He's not going to lose touches to anybody, and you know the volume is going to be there. Look for a little bit of a bounce-back game here this week. For the Vikings, it's kind of the opposite with Dalvin Cook, right? I mean, he's averaging only 14 touches per game, but he's averaging 18.7 fantasy points per game. He's getting 80% of the snaps, so we're not worried about Alexander Mattison, and the efficiency is definitely there for Dalvin Cook, which is great, because if he's not out there having to touch the ball more than 20 times a game, hopefully that keeps him fresher, keeps him healthier, and it helps our fantasy football teams a little bit more. Going up against Tennessee, they allow on average just about 22 fantasy points per game. So Dalvin Cook should be in for another great solid day here in week 3. We just saw James Robinson against this same Tennessee defense put up a solid day himself. Expect the same, if not a little bit better, from Dalvin Cook. Football team in Browns up now, and has the Antonio Gibson era finally started in Washington. Well, in week 2, he saw 65% of the snaps and led that backfield, turning it into 13 carries for 56 yards and a touchdown, but he needs more involvement in the passing game, right? That's what's really going to give him that safer floor on a weekly basis where we can trust putting him into our lineups. Now, Washington, they're going to be without starting guard Brandon Scherf this week, which is a big loss to the offensive line, and Cleveland has only allowed 14.2 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, which is 7th best in the NFL. I like where this is headed. I like Antonio Gibson's skill set, and I think maybe here over the next few weeks, it may develop into something where we can start as a flex play on a weekly basis. But this week, I'm going to go ahead and leave him on the sit list. For Cleveland, you can never really sit Nick Chubb or Kareem Hunt, right? But similar to Kenyon Drake last week, where we tempered expectations, we need to do the same thing here. Washington only allows 9.2 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's 2nd best in the NFL. In fact, they only trail the Baltimore Ravens, and that's only by 0.1 fantasy points per game. This is an elite front 7 for Washington. We've been talking about it for weeks. We know both these guys have that opportunity at touches. They're both going to see over 14.5 touches in this backfield, and they're both averaging over 15.5 fantasy points per game. Tough matchup, but you can't afford to sit them. They're both in the start column. Rams and Bills up now, and you can kind of see where my concern was preseason here with the running game of the Los Angeles Rams, right? I mean, week 1, Malcolm Brown comes out and looks absolutely great. Week 2, Cam Akers, he goes down with a rib injury. Malcolm Brown goes out with a finger injury. In comes Darrell Henderson, and the guy performs just as good, if not better, than Malcolm Brown did in week 1. So now what? Now it sounds like there may not be a Cam Akers this week, but Malcolm Brown's going to play, and how even is this split in this backfield between Brown and Henderson? Buffalo allows right around 16.5 fantasy points per game, but it's going to come down to touchdowns. Which running back gets those goal line carries is going to be the safer play for the week. The problem is none of us know that, right? Malcolm Brown's going to be out there. He had a small procedure on Monday to fix his broken pinky finger. He's going to be in a splint. He's going to play. Part of me thinks, though, that they're going to slightly tip the scales towards Darrell Henderson and try to avoid any more serious injury to that hand of Malcolm Brown. If that's the case, I trust Henderson slightly more than Brown this week, but it's a 100% crapshoot just because that split could be so even. For Buffalo, the same type of thing, right? A split between Devin Singletary and Zach Moss. Singletary 56% of the snaps, Zach Moss 46% of the snaps just last week. Both these guys averaging right around 7 to 8 fantasy points per game and getting right around 10 touches a week. The Rams are allowing 24.7 fantasy points per game, which is 9th most in the NFL. And with injuries, I don't have an issue starting either one of these guys. Honestly, with the increased snap percentage of Devin Singletary and being slightly more involved in the passing game, I lean Singletary here this week as a flex play over Zach Moss. It just depends on your roster, right, though? Zach Moss has some value, especially in deeper leagues this week. I would just prefer to lean towards Singletary for another week or two in hopes that he can continue to build off the snap percentage and find the end zone here this week. Bears and Falcons now, and David Montgomery is coming on strong, right? I mean, he looked great in week 2, and he's involved in the passing game. He actually had more targets than Tariq Cohen did. He's averaging right around 16.5 fantasy points per game, and Atlanta is giving up points in bunches to running backs at 22 fantasy points per game. The cherry on top, Mitch Trubisky is actually looking like a pretty good quarterback, and he's able to move the ball down the field through the air, which is only opening up more running lanes for David Montgomery. I got him as a must-start. My Manscaped must-start of the week is going to be David Montgomery. Speaking of Manscaped, our sponsors here this year, and if you're looking for some amazing products to take care of your boys, head over to manscaped.com, enter the code HEADLINERS, all caps at checkout, and receive 20% off your order and free shipping. Don't miss out on that great offer right now. Now, as for the Atlanta Falcons, we're talking about Todd Gurley, and I love the volume that Todd Gurley is getting, right? 18.5 touches per game is great. The problem is, they're not efficient touches right now because he's only averaging 9.4 fantasy points per game, which is not good for that amount of touches. The biggest issue I see, he's not involved in the passing game, which is a huge surprise. Yes, they have Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Hayden Hurst, but they could really utilize, Todd Gurley a little bit more in this short passing game just to try to keep the defense a little bit more honest. It's a tough matchup going up against the Chicago defense. They allow right around 17 fantasy points per game, but with all the injuries that are going on, there's no way that you can sit a running back that's averaging right around 18, 19 touches a week. You got to hope that this week is the week that Todd Gurley finds the end zone and really helps carry your fantasy team from a safety perspective here in week 3. Panthers and Chargers next, and for all you Christian McCaffrey owners, at least it wasn't season ending. I mean, that's about as good as I can possibly say. This looks pretty similar to what we saw last year with Saquon Barkley, right? High ankle sprain, tries to beat the timeline to come back. It wasn't exactly explosive until the very end of the season. Is that what we're looking at for Christian McCaffrey? It's a different person. They're going to heal differently. He's going to try to come back as quick as possible, but it scares me. It's something we need to talk to Dr. Ethan Turner on this week's injury episode, so make sure you don't miss that one. In the meantime, though, it's Mike Davis time. No, I'm not overly excited either. However, he did see 8 targets last week, which kind of piques my interest, but it's just a super tough matchup, right? Going up against the Chargers, who allow only 9.1 fantasy points per game, which is tied for first in the NFL with the Baltimore Ravens. I don't really want any part of this, right? It's an elite front, and Carolina is going to have to throw the ball down the field this week. I don't want to sit back and rely on Mike Davis unless I have no other choices. Now, for the Chargers, going full Ron Burgundy over here, if you know what I mean. I mean, Austin Eckler, Joshua Kelly, both averaging over 18 touches a game, both averaging over 12 fantasy points per game, both getting over 52% of the snap. I mean, these guys are on the field together at some point, and they are being utilized by this coaching staff. The Carolina Panthers, they give up 36.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's the most in the NFL. We want to see Justin Herbert out there on Sunday. If he is, look for a huge day for Austin Eckler and Joshua Kelly. Jets and Colts up next, and I had no idea Nyheim Hines was a magician. I mean, he disappeared right in front of our eyes in week 2. No idea what happened to the guy. I mean, I love Jonathan Taylor. Don't get me wrong. I like Jonathan Taylor a lot, but I expected to see a little bit more of Nyheim Hines, especially after Paris Campbell went down so early. I thought for sure Nyheim Hines was going to see more of that short passing work, but instead, Jonathan Taylor comes out and out-touches him 28-1. 1 touch for Nyheim Hines. Even Jordan Wilkins saw 9 touches. What's going on there? Nyheim Hines looked great in week 1, and behind this offensive line and the way that they schemed him into that game plan was perfect. Why did they abandon it altogether? I really don't know. Jonathan Taylor is averaging right around 15 fantasy points per game, and the Jets allow 24.7 fantasy points per game. Jonathan Taylor is going to be a weekly must-start here, probably for the remainder of the season, as long as he's healthy. Nyheim Hines, being that he all of a sudden just disappeared altogether, makes him way too risky to start here in week 3. Jordan Wilkins, not interested in either. If it's not Jonathan Taylor, we're not touching it here in this backfield. As for the Jets, you got Frank Gore. And Frank Gore saw 21 carries last week for only 63 total yards. I mean, this offense in New York just isn't good, right? I mean, they're dealing with injuries with their pass-catching weapons. The offense as a whole under Adam Gase is just horrible. You can add Robbie Anderson's name to the list of players to leave Adam Gase and just be better. Plus, Indianapolis, they only allow 13.4 fantasy points per game, which is 5th best in the NFL anyway. I like Frank Gore, just not going to start him for my fantasy football team here in week 3. Cowboys and Seahawks up now, and it's pretty straightforward here, right? I mean, you're obviously going to start Ezekiel Elliott. Seattle does only allow 13.6 fantasy points per game, though, which is something to keep in mind. It's not the best matchup, but Zeke is touching the ball 26.5 times a game. He's an obvious must-start. Same kind of goes for Chris Carson, right? I love the passing work that they're giving him here this year. That takes his fantasy value to a whole nother level. And the way that Seattle works in Carlos Hyde at times really keeps Chris Carson fresh, and that's what's going to keep him healthy all year long. That was unexpected coming into the year, and that's why he may be successful as long as they can keep him healthy. Chris Carson is averaging right around 20 fantasy points per game, and Dallas allows about the same, 19.4 fantasy points per game. I'm looking for Russ to continue dealing down the field, and if he does to DK and Lockett, the holes are going to be huge for one Chris Carson. He's going to be an obvious must-start for me here in week 3 also. Bucks and Broncos now, and the most 2020 thing is me giving Ronald Jones too much credit. I mean, who expected to see that in 2020? I mean, he couldn't even last 2 weeks with the job. He fumbled it away, and in comes Leonard Fournette, who looks like he's basically already taken that job. He capitalized in week 2 with only 12 carries, 103 yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground, 4 receptions for 13 yards through the air. This is going to be Leonard Fournette's backfield going forward. Now, don't get me wrong. Ronald Jones is going to find success at times. He's absolutely going to. He's going to have a big game here or there. What makes him not startable right now is it's going to be super inconsistent, and you're never going to know when it's going to happen. I'm going to sit Ronald Jones and start Leonard Fournette here going up against the Denver Broncos, even though they do only allow 15.1 fantasy points per game. Having a healthy Chris Godwin back to go with Mike Evans and Gronk, O.J. Howard, Leonard Fournette in the backfield with Tom Brady, it's really going to open up that running game. I like Leonard Fournette still this week. For Denver, there's still no Phillip Lindsay, right? Which only means more touches for Melvin Gordon. He's averaging right around 19 touches per game on average, which is great. It's a tough matchup going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but with no Drew Lock, with no Cortland Sutton, does that just mean that Tampa Bay loads up to try to stop the running game? That is entirely possible, so I'm going to limit expectations a little bit for Melvin Gordon, just hoping he can be a solid flex play for a lot of people. With the injuries, more than likely Melvin Gordon is probably your running back too, and if it is, temper expectations. This is going to be a difficult Sunday for him, at least it looks that way on paper. Lions and Cardinals up next, and the time has finally come for Kenyon Drake owners to rejoice, right? He's started off a little bit slow, but look at the 2 first matchups he's had this year. Week 1, a healthy San Francisco team. Week 2, the elite front 7 of the Washington Redskins. Now he gets the Detroit Lions, who give up over 32 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. and we don't have to overly worry about Chase Edmonds. Last week, Drake out-touched Edmonds 20-7. The biggest worry, Kyler Murray scrambling is taking away some of these touchdown opportunities for Kenyon Drake. So that's something we need to pay attention to here going forward. Now for Detroit, we have another major split here, right? Adrian Peterson, Kerryon Johnson, DeAndre Swift, they all had right around 7 to 10 touches this past week. It's a pretty even split. Swift may have the slight edge just due to his involvement in the passing game where he had 5 receptions for 60 yards. That gives me a little bit more of that warm fuzzy on the inside. The problem is it's just not consistently, double-digit volume, which makes him a safer play, coming into this week. Now, Arizona does allow over 27 fantasy points per game, which is a great matchup for the Detroit running backs. The problem is, which one do you choose? They're all a gamble. None of them saw more than 34% of the snaps. None of them are a safe play. If I had to close my eyes and throw a dart on one of them, I'll take the passing work and I'll take DeAndre Swift here this week for the Lions. Moving on to the Packers and Saints, and it takes a man to admit when he's wrong, especially when he's looking into a camera talking to the internet, but through 2 weeks of the NFL season, I was wrong on Aaron Jones. Apparently, the Green Bay Packers have completely punted their first 2 picks of this year's NFL draft because they're not using either one of them. This backfield is dominated by Aaron Jones, and A.J. Dillon just is not a thing right now. Jones averaging 21 touches a week and averaging 29.6 fantasy points per game while only playing 48% of the snaps, which means the more he plays, he can only score more. That is scary for everybody who has to play against Aaron Jones. Now, the Saints, they only allow 18.2 fantasy points per game, but there's no way you can sit Aaron Jones in this offense right now the way that he's being utilized. He's going to be an obvious must-start for me. Same goes for New Orleans and Alvin Kamara, right? Because it looks like Kamara all the time for the Saints. 20 touches a game, 27.6 fantasy points per game, and with no Michael Thomas, that only equals more Alvin Kamara. Drew Brees just does not look comfortable without Michael Thomas. The only time he does look comfortable is when he's getting the ball in the hands of Alvin Kamara on those short underneath routes. Now, Green Bay allows just over 24 fantasy points per game, and with Latavius Murray only seeing 27% of the snaps as of right now, this backfield is dominated by Kamara, and I look for him to have another big week here in Week 3. Monday Night Football, probably the game of the week, right? Chiefs and Ravens is going to be fun to watch. And Clyde Edwards-Helaire is coming off a game where he only had 10 carries for 38 yards on the ground, 6 receptions for 32 yards through the air in that difficult matchup that he had with the Chargers this past week. We talked about their front seven a little bit earlier. It doesn't get any easier this week, right? Now he gets the Baltimore Ravens and the number 1 ranked rush defense against these opposing running backs. I mean, they only allow 9.1 fantasy points per game. You have to start CEH, right? So many people gave me so much crap for having to take him in the first round that you can't afford to sit him by any means. However, temper expectations slightly here this week because it's another difficult matchup that he has to deal with. For Baltimore, another solid, efficient Mark Ingram style game that we saw in week 2, right? 11 touches, 77 yards, and a touchdown. Gus Edwards, he actually saw a little bit of the work on the ground, and no J.K. Dobbins. He kind of got the scraps. Why so? They're trying to get these guys reps, right? The first week they threw JK in there, got him the reps late in the game. This week it was more Gus Edwards. They're trying to keep this backfield fresh so they're all healthy and they're all ready to go. They're all kind of in sync and prepared to take game action whenever needed. The last time these two teams met, Mark Ingram rushed for over 100 yards and had 3 touchdowns. Now, this is a pretty important game, right? Kind of a statement game for both of these teams trying to solidify their NFL dominance. If that's the case, they're going to trust the veteran, look for Mark Ingram to have a heavy role, at least out of the gate. And if he can find success early, they may ride him all the way through. Kansas City does allow over 22 fantasy points per game on the ground, and Mark Ingram could be the main beneficiary for those. I'll start him this week. Edwards and Dobbins, they're more of just cleaning up the scraps here as we move on throughout the season. All right, so those are my starts and sits for the running back position here, Week 3 fantasy football. Hopefully that helps make some of your decisions a little bit easier. Maybe you have a couple guys that were given a start designation and you don't know which one to choose. Don't worry, our rankings video will be coming out later in the week to help you make those little bit more difficult decisions for your lineups. If you have any questions, comments, leave them down below in the comment section. We do our best to get to as many as possible, but if you're looking for guaranteed answers to your fantasy football questions, That happens on Patreon. The link is down below for $10 a month. The Pro tier gets you guaranteed responses to your fantasy football questions if that's what you're looking for. We greatly appreciate the support. We love that we hit 100K this week. We're celebrating all week long. We thank you for that. Hopefully you guys have a great week this week. Good luck this weekend, and we'll be talking to you later.